Welcome to the show, Shane. How you doing?
Boom. What's
Hey,
going on?
John. How's things?
They're good. You know, the market's melting down. It's a little chaotic, but a lot to talk about and a lot of interesting opinions flying around on both sides. Hopefully, things are doing better for you. Massive launch today. Congratulations. Can you break it down for us and maybe introduce yourself as well? Thanks a lot.
Yeah. So we're at the world's biggest Navy trade show
Cool.
here in DC, so the Sea, Air, and Space Conference, and we're in the dive bar. I know the kids are behind me.
Nice.
Our
Nice work
marketing
there.
guys are epic. So
I love it.
yeah, so we've got in the dive bar. So my name's Shane Arnott. I'm the Senior Vice President for Maritime business line here in at Anduril. So yeah, really, really, really big conference for us, and two brand new products, Seabed Century, Copperhead going public today. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
Can you maybe let's start with Seabed Century. What was the genesis of the project? What's the need? And then what does the product actually do, just for like a layman? Can you hear me?
Yeah, so Seabed Century is about undersea awareness, if you will. So hopefully, am I coming through okay for you guys?
Yeah, you're good.
Yep.
Yep, great. So it's pretty crazy. Like if you zoom out, like as a species, we know less about the seafloor than we do about the moon or Mars. Like some 70 to 80% of the seafloor is uncharted, which is crazy. So it's a good place to hide if you're a submariner. It's also a good place to hide if you're the threat. So we kind of created this system, if you will, to be able to bring light to the deep, dark sea, if you will. So you look at kind of vast amounts of infrastructure, so 90% plus of internet traffic. So this particular podcast would be running across subsea cables.
Yeah.
Many nations have their gas lines under the waves. These are broadly unprotected, unwatched right now. So the greatest vulnerabilities are below the waves, and no one's really talking about it or working on it, apart from some super secret things, and we kind of think that's wrong. So Seabed Century came from that place. As you know, Andrew, we can invest our own money, put points towards things that we care about, and we believe this is a big issue that people should be working on. So hence Seabed Century.
Is Seabed Century, do you expect, DoD, our allies, et cetera, to be the main buyers, or is this the kind of thing, if you are in the business of laying undersea cables, would those types of companies be customers as well, or is it purely defense applications?
No, we definitely see it as dual use, like anyone who's got energy infrastructure. One of the key things I will lay out is this is a cableless system. So it's completely wireless. So all the systems, as you guys probably know, are Cold War era. You need big cable laying ships to put these systems on the sea floor. Almost impossible to upgrade. These are completely wireless, fully electric, and you can place them in the ocean. Specifically, we can use some of our autonomous submarines, so you can place them covertly or clandestinely, which isn't a bad idea if you're setting up security cameras and the bad guys know exactly where all your surveillance systems are. Kind of defeats the purpose a little bit. So this approach is different thinking, if you will, that we can place them anywhere on the planet. We can get one of our submarines, and you can place it with all sorts of different payloads in the body of it for long-range surveillance, for listening, for other actions that you might be taking as well. So,
can you talk about the broad risk of undersea drones? I imagine it's the same type of dynamic as traditional air-based drones, and that you could send a $10,000 drone to destroy a pipeline that could cost $1 billion or cause $1 billion of economic damage. And so the whole ratio is pretty thrown off, but I'd be curious, like, is it something that's not getting enough attention? Because it feels like right now kamikaze drones and everything in Ukraine is sort of like dominating the narrative, but clearly you guys are have found this important enough to put a lot of R&D into it.
yeah, the maritime environment's been kind of slow to the punch, to be honest. Like you look at the proliferation and the success of robots in the Ukraine conflict, and everyone looks back now and goes, yeah, of course, this was a better idea. And you also see kind of crazy things like Patriots being used to drop UAVs that are a tenth or a hundredth of the cost. The unit economics of that exchange just doesn't make any sense. So
Yep.
maritime domain, just on the military side, exactly the same. There is a proliferation of unmanned underwater vehicles, primarily from the Chinese and the Russians, also unmanned surface vehicles as well. And if you're going to utilize, and this is probably a good segue to the Copperhead, which is the next thing that we announced, which is a fast, flexible payload AUV, which could be made into a munition, so a torpedo, if you will. That particular system is built to be at a fraction of the cost of, say, like a Mark 48 or a Mark 54. These are very prevalent torpedoes for your listeners who aren't familiar with that. But when you're launching a Mark 48 against a USV that's like a tenth of the cost, the economics don't sort of work. So we've specifically built these things to be at a price point that's a fraction of. We can also build them at thousands per year, whereas kind of right now, you may be lucky to get 100, 200 torpedoes out of the supply chain as it exists today. And again, that exchange ratio just does not work against kind of the fight that we're facing into. So the Asia Pacific fight with China, clearly that's a water-based conflict that's coming. But also people don't talk a lot about the high north. So, and that's where Russia is dominating. So, there's a lot of great stuff sitting under the ice that's now retracting. Everyone wants a piece of that. Some of the discussion around Greenland and others is the basis of why the high north's kind of the next focus, if you will. So having these capabilities that are fully electric, so we can get them under the ice caps, for instance, is of interest to folks. The ability to do it en masse, affordably, in order to kind of deal with a very wide waterfront is kind of the basis why we invest in these capabilities.
Can you talk a little bit more about the trade show that you're at, and exactly what type of buyer are you interfacing with? What kind of points are you trying to make to them beyond just, hey, there's this new thing, it's important and cool?
Yeah, so as I said, what's happening around me at the moment, world's biggest navy. There's everything from frigate to, weapon systems, whatever else that's kind of happening. So I think a big part of what we're trying to paint, if you will, is the ability to mix match. So we've got our autonomous underwater submarines that are, in effect, motherships for delivering these things, plus the Seabed Sentry, plus the Copperhead, and just to be able to give the creativity back. And it's not an obvious thing. So enabling, within the Dive XL, which is our big underwater submarine or autonomous submarine, I should say, we can put dozens of Copperheads in. We can put a dozen Seabed Sentries. Wow. So the ability that you can kind of mix and match and give more creativity to the commander, and that's not immediately obvious. So just kind of, we've got virtual reality experiences for people to kind of, here's how I would do this, as well as coming into our dive bar that we have here to, have the conversation. But it's not obvious. A lot of this is second order kind of understanding for what's incredibly wicked, difficult problem that the subsea warfare environment kind of presents, if you will. So that's what it's about, being able to come here, start those conversations.
I always notice that both the dive submarines and the new Copperhead are square. Are there advantages to that? Does that mean that you're less compatible with old torpedo tubes, or is there some sort of backwards compatibility, or does it just not matter and it's better to stack in, a shipping container as you ship these around the world?
Yeah, great question. So truth be told, it all started with Palmer. Okay. So Palmer Lucky, our founder. And, I was kicking around and said, boss, we're looking at doing a torpedo. And he said, but make sure it's square. Okay. And I was like, well, why? So anyway, we took it away and the guys did the numbers. And interestingly, for what we're doing, it's actually faster.
Wow.
So given we've got the software magic to fly these things, it actually flies more stable and quicker for the application that we want. Secondary is then the manufacturing. It's a lot easier to manufacture something that's like, you know, a bathtub as opposed to a big spherical pressure vessel thing. So that was very significant as well. So those two kind of together is why that's the case. Now, it is a similar diameter to existing effectors like the Mark 48, so they could be used. It's not our intent at this stage. So our intent is for this to be launched off an autonomous effector, to be launched off an autonomous submarine. And it makes the integration and the safety case a lot easier when you're both sides of that equation. So when you're the Archer and the Arrow, you can just go a lot quicker when it comes to changing the threat, changing the seekers, changing the capability. You can pivot a lot quicker. So that was the basis of the intent. But certainly a lot of customers have asked the question that you've asked, so we'll look into it.
Maybe last question for me. Just curious, does Anduril have scuba divers on the payroll, or do you guys observe the R&D and the testing process using other? Is it fully autonomous end to end? You just sort of launch them and say goodbye and then watch from on board, or I'm curious. Whatever you can share, I think it'd be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, part of the dev process is things go wrong. So I'm a scuba diver. So when things go wrong, I'll stick the tanks on and jump in as will the team. So, I mean, it's the iterative process. So it doesn't work all the time, but we're able to spin the wheel fast enough to get to good from, you know, bad fairly quickly. But yeah, certainly all the team, everyone's big enthusiasts of the water space. It's not a terrible thing in the group, because all the tests are horrible places like Florida and, you know, Sydney or, you know, California or whatever. Previously, I did fast jet stuff, and the test ranges for the Air Force guys are in these awful, dusty places. So it's not a terrible thing doing Navy projects
That's
nowadays.
Great. I mean, last question for me, and then we'll let you go, get back to the important work you do.
Get back to the dive bar.
Get back to the dive bar. I would love to hear about some of the challenges of communication in the underwater domain. Obviously, you're flying a drone around. You might be able to talk to Starlink. There's tons of satellites and other drones up. When you're underwater, signals don't travel as far. That feels like it makes autonomy more important, being able to operate even if the connection gets lost. But can you talk about how you're thinking about communication and signal transmitting across the different fleet?
Yeah, 1,000%. So underwater is the worst domain. So comms suck. There's no GPS, all the things that you rely on for an autonomous system. So it is the masterclass for autonomy. So not space, not air, not surface, not land. It is subsurface. It's the most difficult, right? So we've spent a lot of time, and I think, you know, Anduril, this is kind of our what we're good at. But this is certainly, I've got probably the best autonomy engineers on my team, because you've got such thin pipes or non-existent pipes. So you're in effect GPS denied. You're a whole mission. You can only pass very, very small amounts of information between the assets, because they all do team together. So in doing so, like, you need to be very judicious about what you pass and when, in what configurations, etc. So it's the most difficult domain, and one of the highest reasons for autonomy. And I think where we're getting the success is we've come with this software first thinking for a particularly difficult problem, which is this. I think everyone can build, you know, a submarine, autonomous submarine. That's not difficult. Having it survive, communicate, act, still be on a string from a human, particularly when you're taking kinetic action, to make sure all the approvals are done in the right order, that's the big challenge. So you hit the nail on the head there. So
I did hear one interesting thing in the Seabed Sentry announcement. I think Palmer mentioned that it can detect biological creatures too. Does that have a benefit, or is that just like a fun fact?
Yeah. I mean, anything below the waves that kind of makes noise. And in fact, you know, one of the big things we want to do is actually detect when the biologics are, you know, seasonally coming through, because you want to be careful when you're actually putting energy into the water, because it can be harmful for sea life. So all of our systems are collecting the pattern of life, if you will. So we make sure that if there's some humpbacks, you know, cruising through a surveillance area, that we're tuning down our sound system, if you will,
Oh,
to make sure that there's no damage to the people who live in, or the animals that live in that space. So that's just, good practice. So it does all those things.
You mentioned that the underwater domain is the hardest from a comms perspective, but Palmer's been talking a big game about doing subterranean warfare and tunneling.
Yeah.
Do you think he's going to give you for a run for your money with an even harder domain, or you think you're going to maintain the crown?
It is a more hard domain, but we'll see what systems actually get employed.
Okay.
So for right now,
yeah,
I think it's subsea, but he's not wrong. He's always a step ahead.
Okay.
Truth be told. So.
Yeah.
Drill.
Well,
it's going to be, eventually it'll be time to drill.
it's time to drill, baby, drill, Palmer and Vanderbilt. Well, thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to come chat with us about this launch. Congratulations. It looks awesome. The design's fantastic, and I'm looking forward to learning more.
I imagine you're quite busy, because I doubt anybody was creative enough to come up with a dive bar at that conference. I'm assuming.
Everyone's coming by, I'm sure.
Awesome.
Yeah, we had to shut it down just for this, so everyone's very upset. They're lined up outside. I'm not kidding. So.
Oh, really?
There
Okay,
we go.
we'll get back to it. Thank you so
right.
much for calling in. We really appreciate it. We'll talk to you
Thanks,
soon.
Shane.
Thanks,
Congrats
guys.
again
Thanks a
to the
lot.
team. Cheers.
Bye.